Welcome in to the Autzen Audibles Podcast. I'm Matt Prehm, Erik Skopil on the show as always. We are knee-deep in our post-spring football coverage, recruiting coverage, looking ahead to football and the 2024 fall football season. But we're going to take a break because both portals for football and also for basketball have closed. And for the men and for the women, both programs on the basketball hardwood side have seen some significant additions, and they've had some very interesting and optimistic offseason rebuilds or reloads, however we want to describe it. And so we're going to dive into the men's side today. There's a lot to recap. There's a lot to look forward to of things that could still happen. And then next week, we're going to do the same thing with the women. Erik and I will kind of dive into the women's roster, and that's one that could take two podcasts if we really wanted to because of how many additions they've had. But
correct,
all exciting. I think both programs are going into a new era of the Big Ten, and we figured the rosters are pretty much set. Let's dive in and let's discuss these. Let's talk what happened and how that happened and how it impacts the 2024 season. So today we'll start with football or the men's basketball team, and Erik's going to kind of lead the podcast, and I'll kind of give the answers to it, and then we'll flip it for the women's side.
And I suggested, because Jared and I just did this football where we kind of broke it down like a depth chart for a position group. I thought that would be the right approach here because, as you said, there's so much movement, so many new players, and I think just kind of running through it. And you also, I should note, earlier this week posted a starting lineup kind of breakdown, a depth chart, kind of how you think all the pieces fit together. So I'm going to start by just running through guard, if that makes the most sense. They lose Brennan Rigsby, they lose Cario Oquendo, they lose Jesse Zarzuela. Zarzuela kind of a rough deal there. He really only got a couple games with the Ducks and got hurt, and now he's gone. That's the way it works in the portal era. They then added Toledo guard Jaheim Moss and Washington State turned Villanova guard TJ Bamba, a player Oregon fans know quite well. He I don't want to say torched them, but definitely hit some big shots a couple of seasons ago. Averaged, I think, 15 points per game in 3 games against the Ducks with the Cougars. Those are the newcomers. And Matt, I let you take it away. Kind of how do you see this fitting together? And like, how would you predict a starting backcourt for the Ducks in 2024?
We also forgot Jermaine Couisnard.
Jermaine Couisnard. Yep.
Yeah. So
as a departure. Yep.
That's a graduation. But they lost 3, I guess we won't count Zarzuela because he was here for 5 games, but they lost 2 role players and Rigsby and Oquendo, and then they lost their top guard and Couisnard. But like you said, Raheem Moss and TJ Bamba are 2 elite, good transfer additions, both seniors. Moss was an all defensive player at the MAC level at Toledo, was an all conference player, and was a part of a team that won the regular season title 3 years in a row and just never could get over the hump in the conference tournament to win the tournament to get into the NCAA tournament. So this is a guy that's at the mid-major level, has played really well on a really good team and has been one of, if not their best guard. He can defend, he can handle, he can create for others. He's got a really good mid-range game. He can shoot the 3-pointer. I think it was a very, very good ad. And then Bamba joins the group as a transfer, like you said, from Villanova, and before that from Washington State. And he's a lot like Jermaine Couisnard. I think, excuse me, I think Oregon went out and was very specific in the type of guards that they went after and finding players that are very similar to how Jermaine Couisnard played at Oregon these last 2 seasons. Someone who's really good at getting to the rim, someone who's really good in the mid-range, and someone who maybe hasn't had any elite year from a 3-point percentage standpoint, but the metrics and the form and the fundamentals are there where he could be a pretty good 3-point shooter. And that's what happened with Couisnard. He was not a good 3-point shooter at South Carolina before he arrived at Oregon, and he left having markedly improved his numbers. And I think they kind of looked at these 2 guys and said, hey, these are very similar players, their styles, and their fit to what Couisnard could do, and they're banking on that. They have 2 of them. I think Bamba starts. He's the guy that probably is the better player. He's also the bigger player. But the reality is Moss and Bamba could play together. One of them could run point guard if they needed them to. They're both capable of kind of playing a small forward role as well. They're both going to play a lot of minutes. Bamba will start. Moss will probably be your first non-point guard off the bench and give you a lot of options. Now, point guard's easy.
Yep.
Shellstead's back. That's critical. Oregon was one of like 3 teams that signed 2 or more top 50 players or top 75 players in college basketball's high school recruiting in 2023, and to bring back 2 of them. And they're the only school in the country to bring back 3 of them for a sophomore year. Guys have either transferred or gone pro. And so Oregon's got they're sometimes in the offseason in college basketball, your best additions are retaining your players and keeping Shellstead and then keeping his backup, Keyshawn Bartholomew, for a 6th year of college basketball is going to be critical. They've got a really good point guard in Shellstead. They've got a really good backup in Bartholomew who could also play off the ball with Shellstead. So you look at your 4 top guards and it's 3 seniors and a really good sophomore. Shellstead could become the team's best player. Would not be a surprise if that's the case. Also is not going to have to be the team's best player because of Bamba and Moss and then also Bartholomew all choosing to come back and play college basketball one more year. So I think they've got a really good guard rotation. Those 4 guys fit really, really well with what Oregon does. And all 4 of them can shoot the 3. All four of them are ample defenders. They all can handle the ball. You're going to have a lot of combinations. And then from a wing perspective, that's where your options become really exciting for this men's basketball team next season.
Yeah, let's just go right to that. The additions that they've made here, I think, are fascinating. We'll get to it in a second. You're too deep, but it's possible Jadrian Tracy, who I thought was kind of a breakout player down the stretch of last year, kind of a glue guy, is out of the starting lineup. And obviously he was starting how many, what did you say, last 15, 20 games last year, Matt?
He started almost the whole year by the time of it. But yeah, Jadrian Tracy was one of, if not their most important guys down the stretch.
Yeah. I mean, obviously you had basically 2 guys scoring all your points. And I apologize before for omitting Jermaine Cousinard from the departures list. I guess maybe selfishly, I was just wishing he hadn't departed because of how he finished. But it was kind of like, at the end of the year, it felt like Dante and Cousinard were your 2 focal points, obviously offensively. And then Shellstead and Tracy were the only other guys, along with some Kwame points, that you were getting much offensive production from. Yep. So they've added some players here that I'm looking at your depth chart, and Tracy's not listed as a starter. And so let's talk about those guys first. Brandon Angel comes over from Stanford. This is a 2-year starter, 13 points per game last year, shot 45% from 3, which is, I'm going to guess they went into the offseason thinking we got to find some more sharpshooters. Like there were some guys that obviously did pretty well. You mentioned Cousinard stepping up from 3 and improving. Shellstead had some really big games from 3, but collectively maybe needing a couple more guys. This is a guy who can do that. And kind of like Bamba, a guy who kind of tore up Oregon at times, like 21-6 this last year down in Stanford, and then 18-4 the year before up at Oregon. So the last 2 times he's played the Ducks, he's averaged like almost 20 points per game. So he's coming over. And then I hadn't realized this until I did a little bit of research pre-pod. Des Lindsay comes over from Florida Southwestern, and I was reading the school's press release, and this is a pipeline to Oregon, apparently. Jadrian Tracy went there. Yep. Kerry Oquendo went there. So this is back-to-back years where there's going to be multiple former Florida Southwestern players on the roster. This is one of the top junior college players in the country. Let's start with kind of your 2 deep there. Maybe let's just look at the small forward position first, and then we can get to power forward. But
yeah.
Explain why you like Angel over Tracy, because I think that's probably one that may surprise listeners.
This is probably the most difficult group to project here, because I think Jadrian Tracy was really solid for Oregon last season. I also think he played out of position. a lot for what Oregon needed him to do. And last year he played a lot of 4-man, and part of that was because of injury. Yeah. But I think at his core, it's probably a case where you're looking at it and saying he's more of a 3. He can maybe play some 4. He can maybe play some 2. The reason why I started Brandon Angel over Jadrian Tracy is he's bigger. He's a better shooter. He's just as athletic. And he's quite honestly, like the track record, he's just a better player than Jadrian Tracy. But this is the beauty of this roster this season, this coming year, is I think they're going to be significantly better next year, even though they lose Kuznard, even though they lose potentially N'Faly Dante. We'll talk on more of that later. But you're putting a guy who was a key piece of a tournament team that won a game in the tournament onto the bench because the roster has elevated itself. I think Jadrian Tracy will play both power forward. I think he'll play both small forward. And I think he'll probably get some time at guard. And so while he doesn't probably start, I think his minutes will probably be right around where it was last season, maybe a little less, because the depth is going to be a little bit better. They won't have to ask every guy to play 32 minutes a game. But I think his usage is just going to change. And it's probably going to be for the better for him individually, because he wasn't tall enough to play effectively against every single team that they played against at power forward. That just wasn't the case. His wingspan wasn't there. But I like Angel's shooting. I like Angel's post-up ability, his mid-range game, his defensive versatility. You can swap him onto centers. You can swap him onto shooting guards, and he's going to be fine. Jadrian Tracy, you can do that with some power forwards, your small forwards, and your shooting guards. I just think Angel's shooting and his versatility probably puts him into the starting lineup, but I wouldn't be surprised in the slightest if Angel is starting at power forward and Jadrian Tracy is starting at small forward.
I was just going to ask you about, and maybe not even starting, but certainly these two could play next to each other a lot in lineups. Like, I wouldn't be surprised if like this, maybe these are their two best perimeter-ish defenders, and you could pair them together and take off Kwame, who we'll get to in a moment here at power forward. Just give listeners a really quick rundown on Des Lindsay. I don't know if we've really done that on the show.
Yeah, he's the wild card, and he was a potential All-American for the JUCO level. His team didn't make it to the playoffs, and that's typically what has to happen for you to have to go to Hutch to be considered an All-American. His team didn't make it there as one of the top, I think, 16 JUCO teams in the country. They just missed it. But he's a 6'6" big man from the state of Ohio. I think he's from Cincinnati and originally, and just kind of flew under the radar. Didn't really get a lot of options from a D1 level. Went to JUCO, played a year with Jadrian Tracy, and was really good last season as a freshman. And then this year has kind of exploded onto the scene. Shoots 40% on threes, a really good free throw shooter. His field goal percentage is good. And you look at his numbers, and you typically look at JUCO guys and say, if they can replicate 50% of the production or 70% of the production at the JUCO level to the D1 level, you're going to have, that's kind of a good indicator of what that player could be. And, he's going to be a lot like Jadrian Tracy, I think. A 6'6" guy that can play multiple positions, can give you some versatility, can hit the open three-point shot, defensively can help in multiple areas. But he's entering a group where, unfortunately for him, like, he's going to have to fight real hard for playing time, because Tracy's an established player at Oregon. Angel is one of the Pac-12's better small forward, power forward guys from this past season, and a multi-year starter at Stanford. So I had Lindsay at the bottom, and maybe Lindsay is a guy that gets time too at guard behind Bamba and Moss. But again, like, this is a guy that's a really good JUCO player, but finding a way for him to play 20 minutes a game is really hard, just because of the depth that they've been able to develop here at Oregon.
Let's move over to power forward. And you kind of mentioned earlier that Shellstab was one of 3 big-time recruits to return for Oregon that, for their second years. Here's the other two, Kwame Evans Jr. and Mookie Cook, who you have in that order on the starting lineup. I don't think that should surprise anybody. Kwame, in part because of injury to other players last year, started like basically the whole season. And I thought had some really good moments. Like there were a couple of games in there. Was it when they hosted USC? I think when they hosted Oregon State, where he was like their best player, second best player for a couple of games. Like he had moments where it was like, ooh, you get why he was a 5-star recruit and somebody who has teams at least interested as maybe a first round or at least an NBA draft pick at some point. So him starting there over Cook doesn't surprise, I don't think, anybody. I do think, to the point we made earlier about getting maybe Angel and Tracy and a couple more wings on the court, you could see Angel slide to the power forward and Kwame play center again. We'll get to center in a moment because that's a very interesting position to talk about for a couple of reasons. But any other thoughts there on Evans, or actually maybe even like what's going on with Mookie Cook? What do we expect there? This is a big time prospect, came from the Portland area. Last year he was basically kind of similar to Zozuela. It's like his time was so forgettable because he was hurt the whole year. What's the expectation with him? I'm curious on what you think there.
This is hard because really athletic player, really long. I know he's only 6'6", and you ask, well, why can't Tracy play power forward or Lindsay play power forward, but you have Cook who's 6'6"? His arms are incredibly long. I liken him to like an Elgin Cook for Oregon. Yeah. They're early in their careers, very similar players too. Elgin did not show up as the knockdown 3-point shooter that he was as a senior when they were a number 1 seed. He developed that jump shot over 3 years time at Oregon. His first year, he came off the bench and he was kind of like a hybrid forward that was just uber athletic, dunked it a lot, and had some decent handles to dish off and for dump off passes. That's Mookie Cook. I think he's going to be a wing defender, a power forward defender. If you play teams that are going to have 2 legitimate big men, like he might struggle there. But college basketball and basketball in general is kind of gravitating or has gravitated towards you really only have one back to the basket big man on the floor, and everybody else is kind of face-up guys. And Mookie Cook's he fits defending the face-up players perfectly.
Yep.
But problem is he hasn't played basketball and by the time the season rolls around for almost 2 years because he got hurt in an all-star game coming out of high school in April, which really limited his development all summer long. And then he tried to get himself ready to play during his freshman year and played just 5 games and had to shut it down because the injury from that high school season never really recovered and just never felt comfortable. And he felt like it was just he wasn't going to be able to play consistently, and it wasn't going to help the team. It would be better from a long-term perspective to redshirt. So he redshirted last season. This is the wild card where I'm kind of banking on Mookie Cook having a healthy offseason, getting himself into rhythm, getting himself prepared to play kind of that 15-minute, 18-minute type role as a power forward off the bench. If he's behind in development and it makes more sense to start Brandon Angel at power forward, Kwame Evans at the backup spot, and maybe Kwame plays a little bit more center because of some things down the road that we'll talk about on this podcast. That's a very real possibility. And Mookie Cook becomes the third power forward on the depth chart and is playing 5 to 10 minutes a game. I think that's just as likely as the scenario that I've put out with Mookie Cook as the backup. I'm banking on the fact that he was a 5-star recruit. He's super athletic. He embraces being a defensive player, embraces a guy and being a guy that does the dirty work. Like he loves that type of stuff. He's never going to be a spot up shooter or, someone that runs transition and pulls up for 3. Like that's not his game. He's attacking the rim. He's hitting the mid range on offense. And then defensively, he's doing all the dirty things, all the little things that don't get a ton of attention. So that's kind of why I'm banking on the fact that he's really athletic and he's really highly regarded and he's healthy now and he'll have an off season to get ready. Kwame, I started at power forward in part because I kind of picked like, hey, these are maybe Oregon's 5 best players and who cares about position? Let's throw them all on the court together. Because I agree with you. Like at times last year, Kwame, he was Oregon's best player on the floor. His issue was consistency. I think he kind of hit the freshman wall at the very end of the year. Only scored, I think, 20 points in the last 5 games of the season. And he didn't score any points against Creighton, and he played 38 minutes in a double overtime game. Only shot the ball 3 times. I think from a scoring standpoint, it also, like, you have to credit the kid. Like he understood his role. Like he wasn't going to be one of the primary scorers on last year's team because they had Dante, they had Kuznard, and then they had Shelstead, who has kind of emerged as one of the go-to guys. And so he didn't play beyond his role. But I do like his potential. I do like his versatility. He can play center. He can play power forward. I think in some cases he probably could guard some small forwards defensively. He moves his feet well enough. He's long enough. He's athletic enough. And he's a guy that as a freshman, he never once fouled out. And I think playing the position that he plays, that's pretty, and the role that he had to play, like, that's pretty good. He put himself into some first half foul trouble multiple times, but he never fouled out once. And I don't know. I'm banking on the fact that the former 5 stars are going to have a huge year in development. And look, let's also be real. I'm sure part of the idea of coming back to Oregon, whether it was turning down going pro or turning down transferring to another school, he probably got some instances where, hey, Kwame, if you do X, Y, and Z and you follow through with this in the offseason, you get better, you're our starting power forward. Like things are trending in that direction. So I think that's kind of how I landed on it. Pick your 5 best and then roll with it. But this is another one where I could very easily see Brandon Angel start at power forward and Kwame be the backup, and they just share the role.
Agree or disagree? Evans has the best or the highest NBA draft ceiling of players on this team.
Agree. Probably. Shelstead's a little small.
Mm-hmm.
We'll see what happens in terms of his growth from year 1 to year 2 and then year 2 to year 3, like Peyton Pritchard had. Biddle is unknown.
That was my next name to bring up just because of the physical attributes.
I think Biddle could maybe get there, but Biddle's got to play a full season of basketball. We got to see that. Moss and Tracy and Lindsay and Cook, probably not NBA guys. Maybe Bamba gets kind of like a look like Jermaine Kuznard did, where he gets invited to Portsmouth Invitational to see if he could play his way into the combine, which didn't happen. Kwame's probably the NBA's most intriguing player on Oregon's roster for next season currently as it stands.
And should we just talk about the elephant in the room now that we're
Dante might come back?
There you go. Right now you have Nate Biddle and Ibrahima Traore, a true freshman, big man who's got kind of like Jordan Bell type of athleticism, but I think super, super raw. And I would guess best case is if, and now that we brought it up, and N'Faly Dante, if he does gain his waiver and is cleared to play another year at Oregon, I'm going to guess they want Traore to redshirt or just barely play this guy, because I think the development's really intriguing, but right away he's just kind of like a run jump athlete. Let's just talk about Dante though. What are we hearing? I know I wrote a story about a women's basketball player who's also from Mali that kind of set off the internet because she suggested, and that didn't suggest, but she basically told me that the reason she came to Oregon was to play with Dante. Now, I will acknowledge the language barrier may have played a role there in terms of, not that she doesn't speak English very well, but maybe some of the nuance was lost of this was the reason. And he said he was playing here meant more like he was encouraging me that he could come. You know what I mean? Maybe some of that. But that kind of came out over the weekend. That was interesting. And then Dante actually spoke at the NBA draft combine on Wednesday or Tuesday this week. And I know you've got updates there. So kind of what's going on here? Because I don't know if we've really talked about this on the podcast. And this would be Like if he's back, Oregon's team is completely different. Their ceiling's completely different. I think the national perception is totally different.
Yeah, right now they're one of the last teams into the tournament without having to play in the playing game, according to ESPN's Joe Lunardi. They're an 11 seed, kind of right where they were at the end of the year last season. Dante, the whispers of this happening popped up kind of like towards the tail end of spring football, so like middle of April, end of April. We put some stuff up on duckterritory.com, saying like, hey, we're hearing some crazy news that could help the basketball team. And then we eventually kind of came out and said like, yeah, like it sounds like Dante's filed a waiver. That happened towards the end of April, right around the spring game date for football. As of now, May 16th, our knowledge, about 3 weeks since, they have not received word one way or the other on this. There are a couple other players across college basketball that are doing this. 2 players attached to St. John's were denied their waiver, and then they filed a lawsuit towards the NCAA for not allowing them the right to play. And that will probably be what triggers the tidal wave of denies or approves for Dante and other players that have done it. And look, it's not a huge number. I think I've heard like there's maybe like 10 or 15 guys across college basketball that are trying to get an extra year. But once that case in St. John's and in the state of New York gets settled, whatever one way or the other, that will probably dictate everybody else's outcome, regardless of a waiver being approved or not. So Oregon's kind of in a wait and see mode. Dante's kind of in a wait and see mode. He said this week at the NBA Combine, he's not heard one way or the other. He's going through the draft process. He tried out, I think he had a workout with the Boston Celtics and a couple other NBA teams before the Combine. He's kind of projected as a fringe second-round draft pick this currently. And on Wednesday, during a game that he was playing in on ESPN, the NBA panel of draft guys that they had covering that Combine on ESPN actually spent some time talking about Dante. And they brought up the fact that if it wasn't for the injury aspect, he probably wouldn't have been at Oregon this past season anyways, because he'd be on an NBA roster in some capacity. And that they made it very clear, like the NBA is very interested in N'Faly Dante. But the reality is, too, he's had a lot of injuries. And it might be in his best interest anyways to come back to school if he gets the extra year to show that he can play a full season and do that and then get himself drafted. In his corner is the idea that, look, this isn't going to be like he'd be a 6th-year senior, but this isn't going to be one where he's like 24 years old. If you remember, N'Faly Dante enrolled early at Oregon, a whole year early. So he'd be essentially a redshirt freshman or a redshirt senior playing college basketball next season, which is not out of the norm whatsoever. He might be 22 or 23 when his season finishes.
And explain to listeners what they're contending in the waiver. Like what year are they saying he needs another year for?
So they're arguing the fact that he tore his ACL 6 games into the COVID 2020-2021 season. And that was the year that everyone got a blanket waiver for everyone gets a free year of eligibility because you're choosing to play during the COVID-19 pandemic. And what Oregon's arguing is, why should a guy who is a freshman during the 2020-2021 season, he plays and then gets hurt as a freshman again in 2021-2022, why should he have the ability to file for a medical hardship waiver, get it, and then be able to play a 6th year of college basketball, whereas Dante played and got hurt during the COVID year, so his free year essentially was gone, and you can't get it back because he got hurt. And they're also arguing that like his rehab process during COVID is drastically different than everybody else's because of all the restrictions and rules that were in place from a medical standpoint of how close you could be to people, how many people could be in a room, could you even do certain things inside. And so they're arguing that like his rehab process, his injury year, like if he had gotten hurt the 2021-2022 season and filed a medical hardship waiver, it would have been approved and he'd be on the team already. So why should it be any different for a year that everybody got a blanket waiver and he got hurt during that year and couldn't use that blanket waiver year?
The rehab part to me is the most intriguing element, just because it is a really good point of it slowed everything down. And when you kind of brought that up off camera previously, I was like, that's maybe almost more of what this hinges on than anything else, because you could just argue that was such a weird year. Like, let's just kind of ignore all regular principles of how we operate and let's just give the kid the opportunity if he wants to play. So I guess last thought, like, I don't know, I know you hate percentages or putting odds on things, but like, is this likely to happen from your perspective? Like, where, from your seat, like, what do you think?
I think that's better than most people anticipate. But like, I wouldn't be up here saying like, hey, there's like a 75% chance that this happens. And it's also not a like, hey, there's a 10% chance that it does happen. It's probably a coin flip. It's probably a 50-50 deal where who knows what happens. And ironically enough, like Mick Cronin joked after Oregon eliminated them from the Pac-12 tournament that Dante should go and file the NCAA for another year of eligibility. And if he doesn't get it, he said he should just sue the NCAA because they have no teeth. They have no real jurisdiction anymore, and no one respects them, and they'll just cave and they'll give it to you anyways. And it sounds kind of like if Oregon gets denied, they're going to, and Dante is going to sue the NCAA and follow up exactly what Mick Cronin said. So if Mick Cronin ever gets upset next year that Dante's on the team, he should just look in the mirror because he's not the reason that he's here, but he put that out into the universe and that idea out into the universe, and now it's kind of happening.
He should get like a legal advisor finder's fee if this comes to pass. Just because we didn't talk about Nate Biddle at all, and I think that's a player. We did, I guess, a little bit just about his NBA potential. Similar to Cook, this is a player whose year was just totally. I mean, Cook, Zarzuela, Bartholomew, so many guys just totally decimated because of injury and things away from basketball. What are you hearing with Nate? How good do you think he can be if he's starting center? Assuming, I mean, I guess it's him starting would be contingent upon Dante's, kind of what the outcome is there. I guess hypothetically, could you see them starting together? Like what happens, I guess, at center? Like, let's play it both ways. Like if Dante comes back, what do you see happening? If he doesn't, what happens?
Yeah, if Dante doesn't come back, Biddle's your starting center. And all of a sudden you've got to go probably find another big man. Because I don't know if you want to rely on Ibrahim Traore as your backup center. Kwame can play that position, but
we should say, Matt, especially with Biddle, who, like Dante, has just never been able to play a full season.
Yes. So you probably go out into the market and see what's out there from a portal perspective and add another big guy. But if Dante doesn't get the year back, Biddle's your starting power. You're starting center. He should be already or is very close to resuming offseason workouts from his illness that he suffered towards the tail end of the second half of the year. He told me in Pittsburgh before the South Carolina game, like he's back. There's no questions. He's real close to doing workouts again, and was at that time that was like late March. So like he said like. It was a case where could he have played? Yes. Was he strong enough and did he have the endurance to play at that level? Absolutely not. And it wouldn't have helped anybody. Yeah. So I think there's, Biddle will be back. I think there's the excitement that he can get healthy. He can have an off season of development. And then it really becomes like, that's another wild card. Like if you throw in the element, okay, if Dante comes back and is on the roster, now you've got a bunch of options because do you go with what the original plan last year was of playing them together, Dante and Biddle as your two center power forward starting combination, and then you eventually kind of stagger them so they're never really playing a ton of minutes after the first 6 or so on the court at the same time, but you're just kind of rotating them in and out at center. Or does Biddle just come off the bench as your backup center, and maybe he's your backup power forward and just swaps between the two position groups? And Mookie Cook gets bumped down to the third spot, or does Biddle start at power forward, and then that's really the only time that he plays those minutes, the very first few, and then he assumes the backup role. Does Kwame Evans start? And I think that's the key here for Oregon next season, is the status of Dante, because if they get Dante back, every other piece from a forward perspective, the depth just gets significantly better, because you're having to either sit Biddle or Kwame Evans. Or maybe, like, in a reality, both of them are sitting and Brandon Angel is your starting power forward. Like, just the number of combinations that Dana Altman and his staff would have would just be exponentially higher than it is currently.
Okay, next order of business, we've kind of established a starting five, which for you would be Shelstad, Bamba, Angel, Evans, and Biddle in current standing. And then hypothetical world, if we throw Dante in there, are we just moving Kwame out and it's Biddle, Dante? Was that what you'd say?
I actually would probably have Biddle be the backup center and keep Kwame in there.
Okay. So we've already kind of established what we think it is now. I think you brought it up at the end there. Oregon has 11 scholarship players currently. The maximum is 13. So there's room regardless of Dante. If Dante comes back, it could be 12. If not, it's 11. That's room to add players. Where are things at? You mentioned the idea of maybe adding another big if Dante doesn't get back. I think that makes a ton of sense for the reasons you talked about, because you'd literally be having 4 guys over 6'8" on the roster, and one of those guys just can't ever stay healthy. I'm knocking on wood for Nate's sake, because I think he's a really talented player, and it's just been a huge bummer that he hasn't been able to play more. But what do you think happens, I guess, with the scholarships? Do you think they try to use all 13 regardless? Kind of what are you feeling?
I think they're going to use all 13. They're not going to just go add a player just to add one. But if they find the players that fit, they'll use all 13 available spots. And then they've been trying to find a big man. Noah Boyd, a JUCO guy that was signed with Baylor, opened his recruitment up after a head coach left, or after the assistant coach left. He was on campus last weekend for an official visit. Today, he committed to LSU, 7-footer, and then a guy with 3 years of eligibility. Really good player, but probably someone that was looking for more available minutes than what Oregon could offer. Yeah. And there's 2 ways that you could look at it here. The first one is, hey, we think we're getting Dante back. We want you to be kind of our backup center, and you're maybe the third guy in the rotation behind Biddle, backing up Dante. So we go Dante, Biddle, you. Is that okay for you? No, I want more playing time. Or you could look at it as, like, Dante's not coming back, but they're viewing Biddle as the starting center, and are you open to a backup role, and you're still going to play about 15 minutes a game this coming season? No. Okay. So they're at least in the hunt for big men. I do think regardless of what happens with Dante, you probably should get one. If Dante comes back, maybe you open the door to a couple other players at different positions. I think they're tied with a guard from Miami that's in the portal right now. But again, like, how realistic is it you're going to find a senior transfer guy that wants to come in and know, hey, we've got our starting point guard back, we've got our starting backup point guard, or our backup point guard back, and we've already added 2 other guards at that position group.
Yeah.
There's not a lot of minutes to be had. So I think if you can find another player to fill that 13th spot, I would do it. But it's probably going to be one where it's difficult to really peg down like a specific star name, just because there's not a lot of available minutes left. If I was in charge of the program, I would do kind of what Gonzaga has done over the years, and they just did it, I believe, yesterday, where they went out and found a young low major, mid major freshman that was an all conference like defender. And he went into the portal and they added him, and he might redshirt for the Zags next season, or he might play 5 or 7 minutes, but he's got 3 years of eligibility. You've got some time to develop him. He had a really strong freshman year. That's what I would kind of do with that 13th spot. If you could find someone that fits that role, that's a freshman or maybe even a sophomore that's got a redshirt year available and they're really athletic and you feel like you could develop this guy over some time, bring him in as a developmental player with that 13th scholarship. I think, Eric, to be honest with you, I kind of think the day and age of Oregon and a lot of these bigger schools bringing in like 4 or 5 freshmen in a year are over. Like,
yeah.
They don't have one. They have one.
They have one.
And they want to redshirt him. And that was before they said, Dan Altman said that back in January. Like they already knew they were going to probably redshirt this guy. And then when Victorious Miller decommitted, they really didn't go after other freshmen that were available. And then it's crazy to think, but like, I almost kind of think like your max every year is going to be 3 freshmen.
And we should note, back to your point about bringing in kind of a developmental player, and even with Traore, kind of the same thing. Like Dana's done this for years with Luke War, he did with Ethan Butler. I'm sure you can throw out 2 or 3 other names that make sense over the years of just like you bring in a guy, and I think War's probably like the best case in terms of the development of you. And he had a good year at Grand Canyon last year. He played in the Eastwood tournament, had some nice moments, but like bring in a guy, you just don't have any expectations he contributes right away, and then hopefully he develops over time into someone who can contribute. I guess Aaron Estrada was a player they kind of did that with, who ended up being a really good
player at Alabama.
Yeah.
Fred Richardson was another one.
There you go. Yeah, back in the day.
Bruce Barron was another guy. Willie Moore. And some of these guys work out, and some of them don't work out at all. And some of them work out for other schools, like Aaron Estrada and Luke War did. And I don't think Luke War would have had the year that he had at Grand Canyon at Oregon had he stayed. But you take flyers, and that's why I think we see this in football way more because they've got more scholarships where they can take a Trent Ferguson this year, true freshman, or a Justice Lowe a couple years ago out of Jesuit, where it's like, hey, this guy's got the measurables, this guy's got the athleticism. Let's see if we can get the skill caught up. And you give it 2 or 3 years, see if it clicks, and if it doesn't, they go somewhere else to another level. And I think that's kind of the move that you would do if I was in charge of the basketball program.
Kind of the last thing I had for you here was let's talk what they actually achieved here in the offseason in terms of what did you think, like what were you understanding of like what they wanted to do in terms of getting better by adding the players, and then how do you think they've achieved that? And then now what's the ceiling of this team with what they've done?
I think they wanted to improve the overall 3-point shooting of the team because last year they had only a couple guys. Part of that was injury and whatnot, but improve the overall 3-point shooting of the team. I think they've done that. And it's by retaining Shelstead, retaining Barthélemy, getting Biddle healthy again, keeping JJ and Tracy, but then also adding – the 3 guys that they've all added are all pretty solid to good 3-point shooters. Angel is a dynamic 3-point shooter as a 4-man that can also play 5 and 3. And then Bamba at Washington State was really good. He had a down year this past year at Villanova, but Villanova was not good. I think so. Oregon's banking on the fact that Bamba playing in their system is going to have a better year. Very similar to even Cario Aquindo. I know. Let's talk for a second here. Like Aquindo's numbers at Georgia were not good from a 3-point perspective, and his time at Oregon, he leaves, and it's kind of more of a what if type scenario with him. Like if he ever could have figured this out. But even his numbers at Oregon were significantly better than they were at Georgia. 7% better 3-point shooter. He shot 33% this past season for Oregon. His field goal percentage was his career high just by a tick. And he did it in fewer minutes. He did it in fewer shots. You look at Aquindo, you look at Couisnard, and the development both those guys had in their time at Oregon. You look at Moss, you look at Bamba, and you think the staff knows what they're doing. They're going to be able to get these guys and their numbers higher. So I think they accomplished adding more pieces to the puzzle that can shoot threes. I think they also were in a position last year. Some of it was injury, but some of it wasn't, where they didn't have a lot of versatility. And they were kind of overloaded at certain spots. Like Rigsby and Aquindo were the same player, a 6'2", 6'3" guard that's really athletic, not a reliable scorer. Defense was not where it needed to be, but couldn't also be a ball handler for you. Like they were very one-dimensional players. I think they've gone out and they've kind of fixed some of that versatility. Angel could honestly play 4 different positions for you on the floor and be fine. Kwame Evans can play 2. Biddle can play 2. Bartholomew can play 2. Tracy can play
a lot.
Yep. Tracy can play 3 or 4. Cook can play 3 or 4. All of a sudden now your roster, it's still basically the same size as it was last season, but it feels like you've added 2 extra players because of guys' versatility and the combinations that you can come up with to play. So I think those are the bigger areas. Like the added shooting, they've improved the overall talent of the team, and the depth is better because they've got more interchangeable pieces, and they're not like, hey, we only can run these 3 or 4 roster combinations. Now it's 7, 8, 9 different combinations you could really roll out. And that's not even throwing Dante into the mix.
That's all I had for you, Matt, unless you had a couple of things that you thought were notable here.
I just think there's going to be some movement. It's May 16th when we're recording this. I don't think we're going to see a finalized roster until maybe July or August.
Okay.
It might be a case where they're done in 2 weeks. It might be a case where they're just going to take their sweet time with the portal and be real selective of who they add. But obviously if a player leaves, they can't go into the portal. So you feel pretty good that at this point, the guys that are on the roster are here and are locked in. Now it's just what pieces can be added to the mix, and we'll see what happens in the next 2 or 3 weeks to 2 or 3 months from a roster standpoint perspective. But yeah, that's all we got. Thanks for listening to the show. We'll be back again next week. We'll do this with the women's side. There's gonna be a lot of discussion here because I think this is one where Erik's one of the few people who knows all the ins and outs of how these pieces are going to fit. So, and there's a lot of them, 9 newcomers on the team.
Nailed it. Yep.
So it's going to be a good in-depth piece of looking ahead to the women's team as well here on the Autzen Audibles Podcast. But until then, thanks for listening. We'll talk to you soon. You've been listening to the Autzen Audibles Podcast.
Talk to you later, folks.